The 80s, what a time to be alive. Even if you were a child of the 90s or the aughts, the wave of nostalgia from the decade of decadence has come back in full force with releases like Stranger Things, It Chapters 1 and 2, remakes of classic films, and even music with The Weeknd diving heavy into synth pop. With the death of disco in 1979 and a demand for change, the 1980s evolved into a neon-soaked, totally rad decade held firmly together with cans of Aqua Net, burning a hole in the ozone. While other decades can certainly be recognized for their timelessness, there's just something about the 80s that reminds all of us of a better time, more than the others.
I'd buy that for $1.
But it was also a time when rebellion in the media would kickstart into the heart of the system with the impending US political race between 1950s actor Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter.
Ronald Reagan, the actor?
It was also a time when the height of the Cold War would shape the entirety of the decade.
The 80s was a crazy time. You know, the Reagan sort of running rampant, the Cold War was still on.
As a gradual response to the change, heavy metal would make its transition from the classic rock and roll sound of the 70s to come into its own with Judas Priest, Motorhead, Ozzy's solo debut, AC/DC's Back in Black, and metal in the US would soon follow. The time for free love and hope for peace was over. It was a time for a revolution. But with filmmakers, their creative dreams would lead to explore more areas which haven't been touched on before.
We had a lot of fun. I think a lot of good movies were made during that time.
The 80s horror films in general, I think, brought us a chance to face our fears in a safe environment.
It expanded, at least in my mind, what horror movies, and I use that term in like the way that horror movies, what horror movies could actually do as an art form.
To be a teenager growing up in the 80s was a dream come true if you were a movie fan, and I certainly was. So, greatest decade for movies ever.
It was the year horror would be forever changed. This is 1980, a new beginning in our 80s horror memories. Horror films have been around since the dawn of motion pictures, with 1896's House of the Devil, and have evolved greatly with each passing decade. But as the genre continued to come into its own, so have the creators, continuing to push the envelope more and more as time went on. When the 70s rolled around, filmmakers became creative with masterpieces such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Black Christmas, and of course, Halloween. These three films in general laid the foundation of horror yet to come. Not only did audiences want more, but so did producers. Seeing the numbers brought in from these thrill rides of cinema on such a small budget, it was a no-brainer to see what else they could come up with.
You know, when we did Corman films, the formula was that every time they looked up from the back seat in the drive-in, you know, you had to have a scare, you had to do something so the girl would jump back in the guy's arms. Valid, but better if you've got more stuff going on. And I think that that's why the 80s horror films still hold up, because a lot of those guys really had cool stuff they were saying.
This episode, we will be focusing on not just one horror film in particular, but a few notable ones that are worth a revisit if you haven't seen them in a while, or at all. While the fun horror films of the 80s as we know them today were just beginning to come into their own, one carried on the grisly midnight feel similar to Wes Craven's Last House on the Left and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from the previous decade.
Maniac. It will tear the life out of you.
With a limited release beginning that January, Maniac stars Joe Spinell as Frank Zito, our titular character who murders and scalps his young women victims, placing the freshly severed mops onto the top of mannequins. Pretty simple plot, right? And to our young viewers, something so simple and gory comes as nothing new thanks to the torture porn era of the mid-2000s, and most recently even Art the Clown in the mega slasher Terrifier.
I think there are a lot more risks on one hand taken, a lot more acceptance of some of the craziness that goes on in those movies.
But at the time, films like Maniac were a shock to audiences, with its realistic and brutal gore, thanks to special effects maestro Tom Savini, an important name that you'll hear more than a dozen times throughout this series, most notably from the original Friday the 13th. It's a raw and grisly film, and while it could just be downgraded to exploitation just for the hell of it,
oh, I grew up absolutely loving exploitation movies.
It's a guerrilla style and avant-garde take on the seedy and sleaziness of New York City when crime was rampant.
What people today can't imagine, I mean, they really can't imagine like it was then, was what it was like to see a good exploitation movie in a packed Times Square movie house.
Things like Maniac, like they are exploring real world nightmares, killers, rapists, the worst that humanity has to offer, and trying to make a buck off of it.
It's definitely not the New York we know today. Although Frank Zito is the main character of the film, one can't really root for him. But Spinell's performance is one to empathize with. The MPAA, now simply the MPA, have always come down hard on horror when it comes to intense violence, but not for dropping an F-bomb or showing boobs in the first couple of minutes in 16 Candles.
I can't believe this. They fucking forgot my birthday.
You know, for some reason. While today's standards may have softened a bit, Maniac had to undergo multiple cuts just to establish an R rating for a wider release. While the film did well at the box office based on its minimal budget, Maniac was criticized heavily for its depiction of realistic violence towards women. Most notably, celebrity critics Siskel and Ebert, the thumbs up or thumbs down guys, sided with the negatives, with Gene Siskel naming it one of the dogs of the week, and Roger Ebert not even making it 20 minutes into the film. It's not a film for everyone, but if you give it a try, you will subject yourself to a grimy character study that moves like lightning.
The ones we remember are the ones that are actually exploring why these people are killing, the impact that those kills have on them, which is why Maniac is always sort of interesting.
Since the 80s, the film has reached a cult status, praising the performance of Spinell and for the film's character study status, not unlike another disturbing film with a titular character as the lead in Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Its true audience wouldn't find its home until later, with the home video release.
Dressed to Kill. Michael Caine, Angie Dickinson, Nancy Allen. Dressed to Kill. Murder, Made to Order by Brian DePalma.
While the 80s saw DePalma as a true master in his craft in different genres, his first film of the decade continued his dive into neo-noir thrillers. Released in the summer of 1980, Dressed to Kill follows Kate Miller, a sexually frustrated housewife in New York City. After leaving her psychiatrist, played by Michael Caine, she meets a mysterious man in a museum. Intrigued, she follows him out of the building, and the two eventually head back to his swanky New York apartment where he quickly fulfills her desires. Upon sneaking out of the apartment, she is immediately killed by a blonde woman in disguise. But that's the only spoiler I'll give you, because the less that's known about this movie, the better. A prostitute named Liz Blake witnesses this murder, which makes her a #1 target by the unknown killer. After being rescued by Kate's son Peter, the pair team up to track down the true identity of his mother's killer. The early works of DePalma show a director who is greatly inspired by Jean-Luc Godard and Alfred Hitchcock. To call him the Hitchcock of his time would be an understatement. And with Dressed to Kill, he wears that badge of honor on his sleeve. From cinematography choices down to the ending, his films contain many references to Psycho.
had the idea, like Psycho, to have the movie star get bumped off, 20, 30 minutes into the movie.
It did moderately well when it was released, but gets criminally overlooked compared to his other films like Blowout or Scarface. The identity of the killer is a total surprise, and while I wonder how this film would play in today's age, Dressed to Kill is a pure cinematic masterpiece from a director in his prime.
At first, no one believed it. Now, no one will forget. Alligator.
What happens when you flush a live baby alligator down the toilet? In this case, it lives in the sewers, surviving off the remains of discarded laboratory animals injected with growth hormones. Alligator tells the story of a young girl purchasing a baby gator while at a tourist trap in Florida. Upon returning, her overbearing father proceeds to flush it down to the sewers. 12 years later, it has grown into an over 30-foot-long killing machine. And now it's up to an officer and reptile expert to stop the beast from killing its residents of Chicago. Yes, a title like this could without a doubt be unremarkable and forgettable, but it's a film that knows exactly what it is, which works in its favor. In the 70s, many films attempted to capitalize on the success of Jaws, and failing for the most part.
There were great exploitation movies made during the 70s. Grizzly's a sensational monster movie.
Alligator was released late in 1980. It could have easily joined the ranks of another run-of-the-mill mockbuster. Yet, with its clever story penned by Piranha scribe John Sayles, the film earned praise from critics and fans alike. It took the urban legend of rogue alligators and other animals running wild in the sewers of New York and cleverly delivered a horror film with sharp wit and humanized characters. Even by today's standards, the practical effects horror films of the 80s are known for holding up tremendously well. Most notably, the film's climax, where the monstrous gator attacks a wedding party. However, unlike Jaws or many other critically praised horror films of the decade, Alligator didn't have to rely on sequels to keep its legacy alive. It took 11 years for its only sequel to come into fruition, but it also lacks the cleverness of the original.
And this was, before the days of IMDb. You couldn't just, you couldn't look up what this was, so it was based solely on the box art.
I'm at a neighborhood video stores, typical of the ones that are cropping up all over the country, and in 3 minutes, you and I are going to get an education.
Horror during this time period was produced so rapidly that most gems were underseen during their initial run. This is where mom and pop video stores and big chain stores would give these films another life. Even gas stations jumped in on the home video market boom. In the case of horror, most producers caught on early and capitalized on the revenue brought in from sales and rentals by releasing them straight to video. Notable legendary producers such as Roger Corman and Charles Band shined in the direct-to-video market, but it wouldn't be for another few years to really catch on for Mr. Band.
If nothing else, we had heart, and I think a bunch of people had talent.
While you can now sit in the comfort of your own home and scroll for hours trying to find the right movie to watch for the night, nothing compared to going to the video store on a Friday night to see if your favorite movie was in or not.
When you're walking down the video store aisle and you're looking at titles and you realize there's someone next to you, you're like, what do you think? Or they say, you seen this? Suddenly you find a compatriot in the horror movie journey in those video aisles. I think that we're missing today is that sense of community beyond just what we find on the internet, but just sharing titles with people in a video store and then seeing them later and building that sense of connectivity. I hope that we get back to some way where physical media is something that we share and not just something that we email.
And if it wasn't in, there were plenty of other options to choose from. Don't have the fog? Check out Humanoids from the Deep, Motel Hell, Mother's Day, New Year's Evil, Christmas Evil, or even Cannibal Holocaust. Just hide that one from your parents, of course. Topping it off with a couple pizzas from Domino's, Pizza Hut, or whatever your favorite pizza joint was at the time made the evening absolute perfection. Hell, if it weren't for VHS or cable TV for that matter, I wouldn't have been subjected to the films that made me the gorehound I am today. Once upon a time, when kids went outside to play and ride on bikes exactly how you would see it in some Amblin film, I biked my way to a local mom and pop shop who didn't give a damn who they rented their titles to, even if it was an R-rated movie, to a 10-year-old. I know. Tell us more about the war, Grandpa.
How do you do, fellow kids?
But holding forbidden titles like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Faces of Death in your hands at that age, knowing damn well you shouldn't, was a special feeling. And gathering your best buds and throwing these titles on during a sleepover, or a spend the night party, as we called them, while your parents were asleep, was just icing on the cake. 80s horror remains as one of the most fun and inventive narratives to this day, with its pushing of the envelope on what it could be or its use of practical effects. And while they may come off as cheesy or cheap looking, you can't deny the cultural impact that it has on pop culture today.
The 80s horror films were where I really started going to see horror films and watching horror films. I worked at a video store, like so many people, in 1983. So it was easy to have free access and go through the back catalog of horror movies.
Well, the memories I have of being a very young kid during the 80s is that horror movies were having a huge sort of upswing in both popularity and variety. And coupled with video stores, you could see so many more movies than you would be able to see at the theater. And I think a great deal of my love of 80s horror movies, and I think my knowledge of 80s horror movies, comes from home video.
Friday, the 13th. You may only see it once, but that will be enough.
What I seem to remember the most is that was seemed to be the era of horror film that brought us all of our standard tropes of one killer, not always explained why, going after a bunch of teenagers in the woods one at a time.
Name the killer in Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason!
I'm sorry. That's the wrong answer.
Let's set the scene, shall we? It's Saturday morning in May of 1980. You were up late the night before watching ABC's attempt of late-night sketch comedy with Fridays. Just waking up, you pour yourself a bowl of powdered donut cereal. The console TV turns on and you hear the sweet hum of static transition into the theme song to Strawberry Shortcake while sitting on the floor in your brown interior living room. Seriously, why the hell was everything so brown? Later that day, you call up your friends to see if they wanted to hang out at the arcade or roller skating rink, and then leave a post-it note on the fridge to let your parents know you'd be back later. And despite the claim made in Romy and Michelle's high school reunion, Romy did not invent adhesive glue.
Yeah, I did.
You did not?
Yeah, I did.
You did not?
Yeah, well, who did then?
A guy named Art Fry from the 3M Corp. We studied in business school.
While riding your bike to meet up with your friends, are you still holding firmly onto the dying days of disco, jamming out to Funky Town on your Walkman? Or were you an up-and-coming metalhead who was breaking the law, or mourning the death of Joy Division's Ian Curtis while listening to The Cure's 17 Seconds? After having the time of your life at Showbiz Pizza, the night rolls around and you and your friends want to check out the newest hot movie. However, this movie requires an adult to be in attendance. So you get a ticket to one movie and sneak into the newest R-rated horror film that everyone is talking about. These are all hypothetical situations that many can relate to, but as a kid, sneaking into R-rated movies was sometimes more thrilling than the movie themselves. Sure, sometimes you would get busted, but the act of getting away with it earned bragging rights at school that Monday. I remember a time when I would tell my friends about certain horror movies that I watched over the weekend, and seeing their jaws drop as I explained all the gory bits made this dorky kid feel like some sort of rebel at recess. And while I didn't sneak in to see the film on today's subject, I did happen to slip into one of its many sequels.
Some of my favorite memories around cinema in the 80s is just going to the cinema a lot. I was a teenager throughout the 80s, so that was the time when me and my friends were always at the movie theater on the weekend. That's what we did.
Like Drew Barrymore's character Casey Becker in Scream, I have always associated Friday the 13th with Jason Voorhees, even at a young age. I mean, can you blame me? For over 4 decades, yes, that's right, 4 decades, the iconic machete-wielding mama's boy has been the face of the franchise.
You could put anybody in that role. That's why Bond is interchangeable. It's the stunts. But horror icons from the 80s, it's about the horror icon. You want to see that character doing what they do in either a new environment or in a new way, but you want to see them.
And in similar fashion to James Bond, we all have our favorite Jasons. Whether it's the goalie-masked killer hellbent on revenge from 3 and 4, the brutal, zombified, pissed-off version, Uber Jason from space, fake Jason, or even the simplistic one with a sack over his head from Part 2. There's no right or wrong choice. His presence in pop culture history has been celebrated throughout the years in video games, comic books, and even some well-made fan films. While he has most undoubtedly been the face of the franchise, we cannot forget the true mystery of the original killer of Camp Crystal Lake. Friday the 13th was born from the minds of director Sean S. Cunningham and writer Victor Miller. Cunningham began his filmmaking career working on documentaries in the late 1960s. His first true film would be the X-rated The Art of Marriage in 1970. While only having a crew of 3 people on that movie, it ended up making $100,000 off of a budget that was a little more than just $3 grand. The production and mild success of The Art of Marriage caught the attention of another struggling filmmaker, Wes Craven, who at the time had also been working in the adult film industry under a pseudonym. Cunningham hired Craven as a producer and to assemble dailies on his follow-up adult film, Together, starring 70s adult film star Marilyn Chambers. It turned out to be another hit for them, and the production companies Hallmark Releasing and American International Pictures offered the duo a budget of $90,000 to make their next film. However, this time they wanted to make a scary picture. That film turned out to be Wes Craven's directorial debut, The Last House on the Left. Originally, it was written as more of a hardcore adult film like their previous collaboration, but with horror elements. And like their last effort, it was a huge success in the midnight movie circuit.
What people today can't imagine, I mean, they really can't imagine like it was then, was what it was like to see a good exploitation movie in a packed Times Square movie house.
Wes Craven would go on to have another horror hit in the 70s with The Hills Have Eyes, but Cunningham wanted to go in a different direction to capitalize on family films with Manny's Orphans and the Bad News Bears ripoff, Here Come the Tigers. These 2 films first brought the collaboration of writer Victor Miller and Sean Cunningham. Hoping for the success of his previous efforts, they just didn't connect with audiences or critics. And I'd be lying my ass off if I had told you I've seen them. Cunningham knew he had to come up with a new and fresh idea, and get behind the cameras quick. That same year, he saw the latest horror film that was sweeping the nation, John Carpenter's Halloween. Upon seeing this, his original idea was born.
And Sean called me up and said, Halloween is making incredible money at the box office, let's rip it off. That is keeping it real.
Okay, so maybe not completely original, but if you're going to rip something off, it may as well be a horror masterpiece. When coming up with the story, Victor Miller tried to think of scenarios that would be adult-free for the teens, resulting in the no-brainer location of a summer camp under the title A Long Night at Camp Blood. But Cunningham had a different title in mind. Before a cohesive plot or even characters were created, he rushed to get the word out on his latest feature by placing a full-page ad in Variety. It featured the title smashing through glass in very bold lettering, claiming that it will be the scariest film ever made. Very bold indeed. With the script, Miller wanted to write your average Pepsi generation type kids. The type of kids any teenager could relate to, and let them run loose in the wild without the supervisions of their parents or any responsible adult, only to have them get knocked off one by one throughout the film by an unseen killer. It wasn't an entirely revolutionary or new take on focusing on the killer's POV, a move first used in Peeping Tom and perfected in Black Christmas, but its use in the film added more to the mystery element to keep the audiences guessing on who the killer is. During the writing process, Victor Miller studied Halloween and noticed a certain pattern to the formula, one that Randy Meeks would call
A very simple formula!
Arguably, Halloween may have laid out the blueprint to the modern slasher, but Miller wanted to lay that blueprint down as the rules that one must follow in order to survive a horror movie.
What those movies bought us is, if you smoke and drink, you're gonna die. If you have sex before marriage, you're gonna die. If you bully other kids, you're gonna die.
For those of you unaware of the original, or if it's been a while, allow me to catch you up to speed in terms of the plot. The film opens up at the infamous Camp Crystal Lake in 1958. After a couple gets bored of the traditional campfire sing-along, the two sneak off for a little alone time. Before second base is rounded, we are treated with a POV of an unseen assailant who murders the poor couple. Before the kill shot actually happens, the opening credits roll on a black screen, with the now iconic score courtesy of Harry Manfredini. We then jump to present day with a young woman named Annie, who is lost and stops by a diner looking for the camp. A truck driver offers her a lift, but before she leaves, she's warned by a local townie, Crazy Ralph, that the camp has
The death curse!
The truck driver elaborates on Ralph's statements and tells Annie that the newly reopened camp is jinxed because of the murders that took place in 1958 and the drowning of a young boy named Jason just a year prior to that. During this time, the film introduces us to the camp counselors, Jack, Bill, Marcy, Alice, Brenda, and Ned, along with the shirtless wood-chopping owner, Steve Christie, as they begin to get things ready for the young campers to arrive. Annie is then dropped off along the way and is soon picked up by an unseen driver. She tries to have some conversation, but it's cut short when the driver speeds past the entrance to the camp. Now frightened, she tucks and rolls out of the Jeep and is chased through the woods where she ultimately gets her throat slit. What makes this setup so memorable, especially for those watching for the first time in 1980, was we spent roughly 20 minutes with this clean-cut girl next door type, who exemplifies all the qualities that you'd see in a final girl. It's a move clearly inspired from Psycho to fool the audience into thinking they are following one woman to the end of the movie, only to have the rug ripped out from under their feet. Going back to the clip which opened this episode, we would see this trend yet again 26 years later with the Scream series. Filming began in September of 1979 at the fully functional Camp Nabibasco, a Boy Scout camp in Hardwick Township, New Jersey. When it came down to casting, most of the teens were virtually unknowns, except for the warehouse punch dancing champion Kevin Bacon, who had previously had a minor role in Animal House.
Thank you, sir. May I have another?
For the lead and final girl role of Alice, producers wanted a name actress and sought after talent such as Smokey and the Bandit's Sally Field, but with the limited budget, they could not afford her. While filming a commercial for Burger King, Adrienne King, no relation, was suggested to audition by a mutual friend of Cunningham's. Prior to this, King had only a few uncredited roles in Saturday Night Fever and Hair. but her audition proved she could act naturally and was the embodiment of the character. The same could be said about the rest of the cast, as they all hit the mark on the typical teen for the time period. One character in particular who stands out is Ned, played by Mark Nelson as the goofy cornball prankster whose character traits are now a must in the slasher genre. Now, with Steve out of the picture, the counselors continue working on the camp. And by that, I mean taking a dip in the lake and soaking in the rays, and maybe partake in the occasional pillow fight while Bill kills the snake. For all of you animal lovers out there, including myself, you may want to veer your eyes in a different direction once you see Bill going after the snake. While many practical effects were placed on the actors, the same couldn't be said for the snake, as this now infamous scene involved a very real snake to be chopped to bits.
On behalf of myself and anyone who's ever harmed a snake, I would like to tell all snakes, poisonous or not, I'm sorry.
Soon after, a police officer shows up and harasses the youngsters while spitting the occasional bigoted remarks towards Ned, who's wearing a headdress. As it turns out, our pal Crazy Ralph is missing, and possibly making him murder suspect number 1 for the first-time viewer. In real life, actor Ron Carroll, who plays the officer, had never been on a motorcycle. So when you go back and watch the scene, keep your eyes on him, as he hilariously tries to handle the bike as he speeds off. Alice then heads to the kitchen to get pots and pans together, when Ralph pops out of the pantry, which causes her to drop everything, and maybe a little chocolate pudding, as he explains he's a messenger of God to warn them that they're all doomed. Instead of scaring the kids away from the camp, it scares Jack and Marcy right into the sack of an empty cabin, unaware that poor Ned has been killed off screen, and is resting above them on the top bunk. While Jack celebrates with a victory joint, he is pierced in the neck by an arrow from underneath the bed, finally jump-starting the slasher elements.
Even when people were dying horrible deaths, they were fun and you would laugh.
While most horror films today rely heavily on CGI for kills, the slasher genre of the 80s treated its practical effects like a work of art. Some films may not be as convincing as others, but with Friday the 13th, the effects were handled exquisitely by makeup maestro Tom Savini. By now, Savini is a household name in the horror community, and is always a pleasure to point out his cameos in movies. But in 1980, this Pittsburgh native was just getting started with just a few credits under his belt. He got his breakthrough courtesy of his fellow Pennsylvania buddy, George Romero, from the criminally underrated Martin, and the zombie masterpiece, Dawn of the Dead. But with Friday the 13th, he expanded on his repertoire by skillfully designing contraptions to make the kills more realistic. You can argue that you don't need gore in a horror film to make it scary, but at the time, it was rarely seen in a mainstream movie. And thanks to Savini's craftsmanship, it became a staple throughout the 80s. With about 40 minutes of solid character development, we then begin to follow each counselor to their ultimate doom, prophesied by the messenger of God himself. Continuing the trend, we still never see the killer, and instead feel their presence, with Manfredini's cues and score. One thing this film really excels at is the music. Today, we rely on loud music cues to tell our brain to scream when jump scares happen. But with Friday the 13th, the creative decision was to have the score as minimal as possible, heightened by a simple whisper.
And I took the consonant sound of the K, K-I from killer, and M-A from mommy. I went up to a microphone and just went K-ah. And we ran it through something called an Echoplex, which was a gizmo back in the late 70s, early 80s, and it ended up coming.
After all the counselors are taken out of the picture, including a returning Steve, we are only left with Alice. She sees a car pull up and assumes it's Steve. She rushes out to help, only to be greeted by a middle-aged woman with a warming smile. She introduces herself as Mrs. Voorhees, a friend of Steve and his family. However, things immediately don't seem right once she begins to tell the story about young Jason drowning in the lake, While the other counselors were off fooling around, her motherly persona switches right off the bat when she envisions Jason calling for help, revealing not only was Jason her son, but she's also the killer. The final 10 minutes is a frantic chase between the two women, which ends in the beheading of Mrs. Voorhees. Finally, just when you think the movie is over with its hopeful music, we get one last scare as Jason rises from the lake to pull Alice in. So yes, technically Jason is in the first film, but was it really all a dream? The reveal of Pamela Voorhees is certainly one for the books, as most would assume that the killer would be that of a man or a younger person. But when all is said and done, it's a mother who loved her son so dearly that she would stop at nothing to get revenge on those who neglected him. While she took it to the utmost extreme, I'm sure any loving parent could empathize with her. Betsy Palmer's limited on-screen time is so convincing and stellar, yet when she took the job, she only did it to pay off car repairs, and thought the script was a piece of shit.
He sent me the script, I read it, and I said, what a piece of shit.
So there you have it. You walk out with your friends amongst the crowd of adults into the lobby of the theater who are all talking about the movie. Was it the scariest movie ever made that they claimed it to be? Maybe not, but you sure will tell your friends all about it that Monday. When you're home and lying in bed, you check to see if maybe, just maybe, there's someone underneath to give you one more final scare.
And it was the first time, I think, as a kid that I was able to understand artistry in movie making. It was more than just, being entertained, but I remember sound design and music and actually looking at camera shots, and it was The Shining that did that.
The Shining is one of the greatest haunted house stories, ghost stories ever put on film. Stanley Kubrick, an absolute master filmmaker, tackles this genre and delivers. It's such a scary movie, and it holds up to this day.
You are concerned about him.
Yes.
And are you concerned about me?
In 1975, director Stanley Kubrick made the technically impressive, but much derided by critics at least, Barry Lyndon, a film about an Irish chap who attempts to make his way into the British aristocracy. The movie was visually and technically impressive, but bombed at the American box office, and was criticized for being overlong and slow. Reeling from the lack of appreciation for his movie, Kubrick decided that his next film needed to be something that would please a commercial audience, and at the same time be artistically fulfilling for him to make. Not an easy mix by any stretch of the imagination. But Kubrick set out immersing himself in the horror genre in order to make his ambitions viable. In fact, he became so immersed in the process that he would confine himself in his office and task his staff with bringing him stacks of horror books to get inspiration from. Disregarded books smashing off the walls would regularly be heard by his secretary. Until these frustrated outbursts suddenly stopped. His secretary eventually went into Kubrick's office to check on her boss to find him fully immersed in Stephen King's novel, The Shining. The movie sees Jack Nicholson's Jack Torrance become the winter caretaker of the remote Overlook Hotel in Colorado, where he also hopes to cure his writer's block. He takes his wife Wendy and his son Danny, who, it transpires, is psychic and begins to have disturbing premonitions that worsen just as Jack's own writing suffers, along with his own mental well-being and stability, to say the least.
I said, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
The Shining is a landmark film in a lot of ways. For me, it was Stephen King was my first sort of entry into horror films, but via reading Salem's Lot, and then reading The Shining after that. That was the second Stephen King book I read. And I had read the book before I saw the movie. And the movie is, it is so uniquely cinematic, and while it is very close to the book, it is also has a completely different feeling than the book, which is strange in and of itself to watch that, to have two very disparate experiences, both incredibly positive in terms of the entertainment value. And that was one of the first realizations that, like, Jack in the book is very different than Jack in the movie. In the movie, he's so in your face crazy, but part of that it's a visual medium. In his descent. Whereas in the book, there's I think you retain compassion for him a lot longer. You feel his struggle a lot more, as opposed to his surrender in the movie. So that was, for me, one of the really interesting things. That was one of the first times there was like two different, because often the book was either better or the movie's better, or that. Whereas in this instance, they were so close yet so disparate. It was a sort of schizophrenic experience, but it has so many landmark images in it, and things that are horrific, and that stay with you forever, and things that are hypnotic, right? It's a very hypnotic film, right from the first chords of the Wendy Carlos score as you're driving up to the lodge. It is dragging you into its world in ways that you don't realize.
What follows has gone down in history as one of the most talked about, theorized, and debated horror movies of all time. And despite it not being well received, critically or commercially at the time of its release, it has nonetheless endured as a classic horror movie in its own right. But what are the most indelible images from the movie? And all the fuss about how scary and disturbing the movie is, I hear you say. And what are these largely unknown facts about the production? Maybe plucky old Freddy had good reason to rent this movie to underage kids, as it can't be that disturbing, surely. Well, it was allegedly quite a disturbing time to be part of the cast and crew of Kubrick's film, as he insisted on having a small production crew, and his tendency to insist on multiple takes resulted in his overworked crew being exhausted. The cast also had their fair share of issues on set, and although he protected young Danny Lloyd by telling him the movie was a drama and didn't let him anywhere near any naked, decrepit grannies, thankfully, poor Shelley Duvall didn't fare quite as well. She does an incredible job of selling Wendy's increasing anxiety and despair after realizing she's trapped in a hotel where her husband wants to bash her brains in and also murder her worryingly psychic son. The stress of playing the character led to her suffering from nervous exhaustion, feeling physically ill, and also losing some of her hair. Just watch what that poor woman goes through in the movie and you can see why.
How could you? How could you?
That old woman coming out of the shower, so scary. The little girls with the blood and the elevator, and I mean all of it. And Scatman Crothers taking the axe to the chest, and the chase in the maze, and the bartender. I mean, what a great horror story.
Despite the working conditions on The Shining proving to be difficult for the cast and crew, they must have had an inkling that they were part of something special. A movie that would be discussed, rewatched, and theorized about decades later. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, I was younger than the certificate of the movie when I first saw it. Thanks again, Jailbird Freddy. Many of the themes and hidden meanings in the movie were lost on me. The most highbrow I got back then was getting a kick out of the shape-shifting alien bounty hunters in Critters 2, or witnessing a gigantic alligator devour people in dark alleys in the underrated movie Alligator. It wasn't until I started studying film and subsequently began working in the movie industry that I was able to rewatch The Shining and appreciate just how complex and layered the movie really is. I also began theorizing about the film and became fascinated about just exactly what lurked behind door number 237. In fact, the recent documentary Room 237 is an awesome insight from 5 very different viewpoints of the movie, each with bizarre but compelling theories about the hidden meanings in the film. One of the most spectacular is that Stanley Kubrick was hired by the American government to fake the Apollo moon landing, and The Shining is Kubrick's way of explaining it himself. See, I told you, bizarre. However, is it as tenuous as it suggests? The narrator describes the evidence in the film in great detail. Jack bickering with his wife Wendy about his work mirrors Kubrick's own justification for complying with government orders, Danny's Apollo 11 sweater, and even a room key with the label Room Number 237, which could be rearranged to read Moon Room. Other similarly fantastical theories include one which suggests that the maze in the movie is a retelling of the mythological tale of Theseus and the Minotaur, with Jack being the child-devouring monster with his facial expressions in the movie said to imitate the creature. There's also a scene where Danny sees the twin girls, and above them are 2 posters that show a man skiing and a fellow riding a bull, but are actually images of minotaurs. Tenuous? Probably. But with such a visionary director as Stanley Kubrick, can anything be written off completely? Another fascinating aspect of The Shining is that it is quite the departure from the events in the novel. In fact, if you believe another theory from Room 237, Stanley Kubrick even included a clear visual dig at Stephen King's novel in order to disown it somewhat. See, in the book, the family drive a red VW Beetle towards their new home at the Overlook Hotel, while in the movie the car is yellow, and you can see a red Beetle later on mangled in a crash with a trailer. It's a subtle FU to the source material, and to Stephen King himself, who was famously vocal about his dislike for Kubrick's movie.
With Kubrick's The Shining, I felt that it was very cold.
While many of these theories can be discussed and debated about for many more decades to come, what's important to remember is that film is subjective, and the mise-en-scène theory taught in film school is actually a massively important part of the visual medium. A personal take on the movie from many during a rewatch would be that it exists as a dreamlike, disorienting experience in which the inhabitants of the Overlook Hotel are all part of Jack in his own version of hell, and are reliving his past as part of a feverish nightmare. Just look at some of the inconsistencies in the movie. The window in Ullman's office can't exist, as the room is right in the middle of the building. And in another sequence, Halloran is giving a tour to Wendy and Danny, and they enter a giant cooler in one room, but exit a completely different one across the room. Kubrick was such a meticulous filmmaker that surely those were intentional. Ultimately, The Shining is a movie so rich in thematic imagery that it is impossible to watch over and over and not come away with a completely different experience each time. In fact, in one scene, we see Jack nonchalantly reading a copy of Playgirl. And if you look up the issue, it has a heading about incest, and the film even alludes to physical abuse between Jack and Danny. Perhaps there was more to this than first imagined, and it won't be by chance that Jack Nicholson was given this particular magazine to read in that scene. Also, rewatch the Toy Story movies, and you'll see many references from the film, mainly because director Lee Unkrich is a Shining super fan.
Velocistar 237?
Oh!
And even runs his own fan site called The Overlook Hotel.
If you're not back by midnight, you won't be coming home.
Now, my love and appreciation for Jamie Lee Curtis may have started with John Carpenter's bona fide horror classic, 1978's Halloween. But I was barely able to walk, let alone watch horror movies back then. In fact, the only exposure I had to television or movies at the time was the early incarnation of Paddington or Sesame Street. It wasn't until the late 80s that I was able to somehow source copies of the older horror movies, such as Halloween, mainly by stealing my brother's VHS collection, that I started to look back at Curtis's older work. Obviously, Halloween has gone on to become synonymous with Jamie Lee Curtis's character Laurie Strode, and vice versa, while Terror Train also helped to establish her as one of the original Scream Queens. In fact, it was a family holiday to the wonderful Vancouver, British Columbia in 1988, and a trip to see A Fish Called Wanda at my emigrated family's local cinema, which, if I recall correctly, was the Varsity Theater, that really cemented my appreciation of Jamie Lee Curtis as an actor. I was definitely under the age of the 14A certificate, so a lot of the more risque elements were lost on me. Curtis and John Cleese flirting in Italian, and of course, the numerous moments that the hilarious Otto, that's Kevin Kline's character, attempts to seduce Wanda. Yep, that all went way over the head of this prepubescent kid. However, alongside the hilariously squashed dogs and flattened Ottos, I left the theater desperate to see just what else Curtis had starred in beforehand. Thus, my love of horror began in earnest. By the mid to late 1970s, Canadian film director Paul Lynch had already forged a career as a cartoonist for the Toronto Star, and had cut his teeth as a filmmaker with a 90-minute documentary on Bob Gucciani's Penthouse magazine. He'd also made the warmly received The Hard Part Begins in 1973, as well as 1978's sports drama Blood and Guts. However, it wasn't until he ventured into slasher territory with Prom Night that he found a genre befitting his many talents, and would create a movie that would still have cult appeal decades later. The slasher genre was very much at the forefront of every gorehound's penchant for horror at the time. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Black Christmas, and Halloween had already made a huge impression on audiences between 1974 and 1978. And that particular era is now affectionately known as the golden era of the slasher genre. Early influences on the genre include psychological horror movies such as 1960's Peeping Tom and the Hitchcock classic Psycho. Both of these movies help to establish the iconography and rules of the genre, in which a killer murders a group of people using bladed and sharp tools such as a scalpel, chainsaw, or knife. Slasher films also typically adhere to a now tried and tested formula. For example, a past wrongful action causes severe trauma in the antagonist that is reinforced and reignited by the anniversary or commemoration of the event that re-inspires the killer to rise from the ashes to seek vengeance. Or, in some recent cases, the main antagonist is sidelined for entirely new characters to help close out popular rebooted franchise trilogies. While the slasher genre was busy creating classic entries in the 1970s, it was also setting up one of its most common tropes that Jamie Lee Curtis's Halloween and Prom Night character helped establish: the final girl. This generally focuses on a young woman, or sometimes a young man, who is left alone to face off against the killer in the film's denouement. And it's a trope that lives on today, with Sidney Prescott and Gale Weathers in the Scream franchise, and even Maxine Minx in the X film series. However, it's a trope that was perhaps most successfully and refreshingly embraced in earlier genre movies, such as Prom Night. While slasher movies were in their relative infancy back in 1980, the release of Prom Night helped to establish a popular narrative in the genre, while placing a fresh spin on it in the process. However, before we dive headfirst into the delicious punch of the movie itself, it's worth taking a brief look at the fascinating history behind how the movie was financed, and how an odd Canadian tax loophole made it all possible. It's probably fair to say that, by large, the Canadian film industry has lived somewhat in the shadow of Hollywood. However, thanks to a tax loophole referred to as the capital cost allowance, or tax shelter films, which allowed investors to take tax deductions for their investment in Canadian-produced movies, there was a significant boom in horror films that were produced in the country. For example, in 1974, there were only 3 features made in Canada, but by 1979, there were 77. Also, not only did the country see a massive rise in film production between 1974 and 1984, but the horror movies born out of that era were henceforth known as Canucksploitation films. Audiences were treated to movies such as Black Christmas, My Bloody Valentine, Visiting Hours, Happy Birthday to Me, The Changeling, Shivers, which by his own admission launched David Cronenberg's career, as well as Rabid, Fast Company, The Brood, and Scanners. Prom Night was ultimately a co-production between Canada and the United States, and thanks to that tax loophole, it eventually saw the light of day. The movie follows a group of high school teens, with hormones and dance moves both raging, who are targeted by a mass killer seeking vengeance for the accidental death of a young girl 6 years earlier. So far, it fits into the slasher genre perfectly, huh? The past trauma for the antagonist serves as a catalyst for revenge several years later, when the anniversary of the girl's death is marked by a memorial for her. Plus, the killer is donned in a genre trope-worthy mask and, well, their best nighttime all-black PJs. We won't spoil the identity of the killer in this video, but suffice it to say, it may be one of the not-so-subtly telegraphed suspects, i.e. the pervy school groundskeeper who seems to spend most of the movie leering at the underdressed and oversexed girls, or the disfigured and shamed sex offender, wrongly imprisoned and back for revenge on those who did him wrong. No siree, the reveal is a little more contrived than that, but does go some way to explain how they managed to leap about with the agility of a ballet dancer high on Red Bull. While it sounds like I didn't enjoy the movie, this isn't necessarily true. Sure, it hasn't aged so well in some respects, but there is nostalgic joy in seeing a young Jamie Lee Curtis wrestle with a thinly veiled script and equally flaccid antagonist. It also breaks the time-honored slasher movie rule that the virgin always survives, with one young lady almost getting lucky before getting killed first. What's cool about the movie, however, is not just the fact that it helps cement Curtis's Scream Queen status with a funky disco soundtrack and some effective kills. It's also in the overall gothic look that Paul Lynch and his team bring to the production design. The opening scene in the nunnery looks great, and the buildings, despite not being overly American, are nonetheless befitting of the genre. Straight after the opening scene where poor unfortunate bullied Robin is coaxed to her untimely demise by falling through a second-story window to her death, the action shifts to her memorial in 1980. Robin's teenage sister Kim and her twin brother Alex are preparing for that night's school prom, while their friends who were involved in Robin's accidental death, Wendy, Kelly, Jude, and Nick, all started to receive threatening phone calls. That's more or less all you need to know going into the movie, and in all fairness, the plot does not thicken a great deal afterwards. Wendy hooks up with the school bully and all-round asshole Lou, who cooks up a very Carrie-esque plan to sabotage Kim's big coronation moment at the prom. In fact, Wendy and Lou are so unlikable that when their demise arrives, it's glorious. But more on that later in the episode. While the cast of the movie is largely great, with Jamie Lee Curtis almost taking a back seat to the rest of the characters, there are some casting choices that had people scratching their heads somewhat at the time. The most jarring of which is Leslie Nielsen's casting as Kim and Lex's dad, Mr. Hammond. Don't get us wrong, the late Nielsen was a wonderfully gifted actor, but when Prom Night was released, he had just come off the back of shooting his hilarious and very silly turn as Frank Drebin.
Nice beaver.
Thank you. I just had it stuffed.
Let me help you with that.
Watching the movie again now, and with Nielsen's then emerging reputation as more of a comedic actor, he just seems massively out of place. This isn't to say his performance is bad, far from it, but when he's dancing at the prom towards the end of the film, you half expect him to fall flat on his face, or whip out and start strumming a double bass. While the cast of the movie works as well as could be expected given the simplistic nature of the script, what really jumps out like a man in a slinky ninja catsuit while rewatching the movie is how charmingly dated it looks. There's noticeable film grain in the print that this particular writer had the fortune of rewatching on a very popular streaming service for this retrospective. The movie isn't exactly a household name, but given its cult status and the recent fascination with the era in which it was released, surely a cleaned up, remastered version would be made available for streaming, right? Nonetheless, it doesn't detract too much from the experience, and although it does take forever for the plot to really get going, and for us to get some decent kills, the pace is severely lacking. We get the story exposition at the beginning, and before we arrive at the climactic prom night of the title, there are several plot threads introduced, but never fully realized. The aforementioned crazed sex offender subplot brings classic Halloween-esque tropes such as the older grizzled police detective who grumpily stares at a map, chain-smoking and mumbling inner monologues about just why exactly this guy is back in town.
Revenge. Against who?
While the opening scene of Scream is chilling, with Drew Barrymore's Casey Becker stalked by a menacing phone call and subsequently murdered brutally, the same level of terror wasn't quite achieved in Prom Night 16 years earlier. When the teens get similar treatment, it's not exactly a disturbing threat that leads to a gut-wrenching death scene. Instead, it's like they've been butt-dialed by an annoying friend and the threat is instantly diminished. There's little menace or tension in the first 2 acts of the film, but thankfully, when the kills come, they are very entertaining, if not exactly scary per se. These movies are called slashers for a reason, right?
The 80s horror films in general, I think, brought us a chance to face our fears in a safe environment where we are watching something horrific on screen, or horrific things happening to some good people, but also bad things happening to bad people.
Freddy Krueger dispatches his victims gleefully with his iconic weapons, his bladed gloves. In fact, the first scene of A Nightmare on Elm Street is the killer creating his weapon. Jason from Friday the 13th also has a penchant for sharp objects, and although his weapon of choice is undoubtedly his machete,
Guys! It's okay, he just wanted his machete back!
he's also partial to some experimentation for his killing sprees. Bear traps, axes, a devil's pitchfork. So while Prom Night doesn't quite match the invention of other classic horror films, when we eventually get to see some action, it at least subverts the genre to a certain degree. First to get bumped off in a true horror trope fashion is Kelly, played by Mary Beth Rubens, who refuses to go all the way with her boyfriend in a secluded locker room and promptly has her throat slit by the ski-masked intruder. You see, usually the movie's virgin would survive, as per established time-honored slasher rules. However, poor Kelly is the exception to this. Also, before we get to see any more carnage, we have to endure Kim and Nick's cringe-inducing disco moves that seem to last forever. And were the Saturday Night Fever-inspired idea for the film's marketing campaign. So I guess they had to be kinda prominent, if not slightly embarrassing for all involved. However, the subsequent kills are nothing if not gleefully entertaining in their own shoddy sort of way. Jude, played by Joy Thompson, is the next to go following an intimate clinch with her boyfriend in his funky, tricked-out van. There's even an amusing and prolonged section here with the slinky ski mask murderer hanging from the door of the van before he finally gets to slay his victims. Nasty mean girl and all-around bitch Wendy is next to meet her untimely yet sickly satisfying end. But not after she's agonizingly stalked through the school's science lab, boiler rooms, and auto shop. This leaves only poor old Nick as the remaining member of the film's not-so-fantastic four, who is just about to receive his prom king crown. However, slinky, sexy ski mask guy promptly crashes the backstage area just as Evil Lou is about to spring his Carrie-esque prank. And the resulting carnage is easily the movie's best money shot, as Lou's freshly decapitated head rolls down the royal runway. Naturally, mass panic ensues, and although it's not on par with the similar denouement of DePalma's Carrie, it leaves a lasting impression nonetheless. Nick and Kim battle slinky ski mask guy for a few minutes before his identity is eventually revealed. Is it perhaps the creepy old groundskeeper, as it's been massively telegraphed that he's a wrong'un? Or could it be in fact the wrongly imprisoned sex offender back for bloody revenge? Well, we won't spoil the prom night party here, but suffice it to say, you're guaranteed to figure it out way before any of the characters do. So there you have it. While Prom Night won't go down in history as one of the greatest slasher movies of all time, it certainly deserves its cult status for many reasons. However, what's your opinion of the movie? Would it still have that cult status without the presence of Jamie Lee Curtis in a prominent role? It has many redeeming qualities otherwise. A fun premise, a game cast who sometimes get sidelined and forgotten about in the narrative, plus that great money shot. It also spawned several sequels of varying quality, as well as a best forgotten 2008 remake with a tame PG-13 rating. Overall though, we thank the filmmakers for helping to guide Jamie Lee Curtis along her path in becoming the badass scream queen we know and love today. Oh, and also for decapitating that asshole Lou. John Carpenter is the last of a generation of masters of horror. We've lost Wes Craven, George Romero, and Tobe Hooper. And while we have a host of new age talent, the old guard has mostly retired or passed away. While the video game playing, music composing curmudgeon hasn't made a feature film since 2010's The Ward, he has created an indelible mark on the history of horror. He had impactful, or at least fun, titles in 4 different decades. While he had hits in the 70s and 90s, his decade of excellence was undoubtedly the 80s. Something we here at JoBlo Horror Originals are admittedly pretty passionate about. It's hard to pick his best of the decade, but there is no debating that he started them off with a hit. Released on February 1st, 1980, The Fog was a hit for both Carpenter and Avco Embassy, making $21 million on its $1 million budget. The movie is sandwiched, theatrically anyway, between the slasher king and the first screen appearance of one of the greatest characters of all time, Snake Plissken in Escape from New York. On top of that, he just kept releasing cult classic after cult classic with efforts like The Thing, Big Trouble in Little China, and They Live, along with some more commercially viable products. On today's episode of 80s Horror Memories, we're taking a dive into what is often a forgotten gem from one of the great masters of horror. Today we're keeping the radio on and taking a look at the ghost revenge story, The Fog.
Well, stay up with me, and I'll figure out some way to keep you occupied.
The Fog is a great introduction to the filmography of John Carpenter. My older brother, who was something of a gateway drug dealer for me in terms of horror, would know exactly what and when to show me a particular movie. I wasn't ready for The Evil Dead, but I could dip my toe into the series via Army of Darkness. A Nightmare on Elm Street was a bit too scary and serious, but perhaps Dream Warriors had enough schlock and humor to not give me nightmares. It didn't work, but that was a valiant effort. While The Thing and even Halloween were too scary for me, The Fog was a great fit. Video Unlimited down the street always had on display that super cool VHS cover with Jamie Lee Curtis trying to keep something at bay, with the tagline of,
"The fog. What you can't see won't hurt you. It will kill you. Between midnight and 1, it will find you."
The Fog is the first John Carpenter movie I saw.
This was the quintessential video store experience. While Blockbuster and Hollywood Video were the places to go with your family to pick out a couple of films to watch together, the mom and pop experience was how you built your tastes. It wasn't just a routine or something to look forward to at the end of the week. It was a damn ritual. We would stop at the corner store to pick up candy, and then walk into Video Unlimited and head straight past the new releases. New movies were and are an important part of the journey, but walking the aisles of horror's past and making a mental list of what you wanted to see someday was great. Most of the VHS boxes were the same size, but every now and then you'd have a huge one like Zombie that let you know, "We are going to eat you!" This was forbidden fruit that I knew I'd have to wait years to get to, but I'd pick up the box every damn week and imagine what the movie would be like. Getting to watch things like The Fog or Motel Hell after looking at the box art and the pictures on the back was just how you grew up. It was always way better than you ever imagined. The movie, at its heart, is a ghost revenge story that follows the town of Antonio Bay on its 100th anniversary, where the crew of the Elizabeth Dane have come back to collect a debt. This debt is of both money and the souls of the descendants of those that conspired to crash the ship so that Captain Blake couldn't get a leper colony started near the town. It's a mostly quiet little thriller with a ton of jump scares that was originally seen as far too short at only 90 minutes. One of the film's best scenes is the opening fireside story session with John Houseman and a bunch of the town's kids. This is one of the few scenes that they had to add in later to get the movie to its final runtime of 90 minutes. While the original idea of the film was to keep it as a classic PG fright fest, these new added scenes of terror and gore shot the final product to an R rating, even if it is a rather soft R.
The scene at the beginning when he, picks Jamie Lee Curtis up, and within 5 minutes they're in bed together.
The movie was his first theatrical film in over 2 years, after the made-for-TV projects Elvis, starring future collaborator Kurt Russell, and The Chiller, Someone's Watching Me, starring his then-wife, Adrienne Barbeau. The talent in front of and behind the camera for The Fog is a murderer's row, pun intended, of Carpenter regulars. In addition to co-writing and producing with Deborah Hill, the flick was shot by Dean Cundy, had makeup effects by Rob Bottin, and Tommy Lee Wallace did both the editing and was in charge of production design. The acting was led by Barbeau in her film debut after years on TV, Tom Atkins, and Jamie Lee Curtis. The supporting cast was Nancy Loomis, George Buck Flower, and Charles Cyphers in various minor roles too. Hell, he even gave characters the names of his friends, like Tommy and Nick, and both Rob Bottin and Tommy Lee Wallace appear as undead creatures in the titular fog. Carpenter himself even plays Bennett in the first church scene of the movie, and throws out the name of his band, the Coupe de Villes, as one of the bands played on the radio before everything goes downhill. It isn't just John and his buddies hanging out making a movie though. A couple of key players were played by bigger than usual names in Hal Holbrook and Janet Leigh. Holbrook plays Father Malone, who is a descendant of one of the conspirators. He finds the journal as well as the stolen gold that was claimed after the Danes sank. While Holbrook is usually outstanding, particularly in Creepshow just a couple years later, he sleepwalks a little bit through his screen time here. Originally, that role was offered to horror legend Christopher Lee, but he had to turn it down after he became unavailable. This wasn't the first time that Lee was sought out for a Carpenter movie either, as he was an original choice for Dr. Sam Loomis in Halloween. I love Donald Pleasance, but I would have loved to see how that turned out. Janet Leigh was an Oscar-nominated actress that had a great career before this movie, and was able to appear with her daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis. The movie's story moves like an anthology, with The Fog almost being a wraparound tale to the intersecting characters that we're watching. Adrienne Barbeau doesn't even appear on screen with any of the other main characters, and instead serves as a guide. She does get her son saved by Tom Atkins and Jamie Lee Curtis, and guides them throughout the town with warnings of where the fog is and where it's headed. This anthology-like idea must have stuck with Carpenter, because for years he wanted to produce a series based on the subject. Instead of having anyone from the movie, however, The Fog itself would serve as the central character and conceit, with other supernatural tales occurring, and only slight threads tying the stories together. Sadly, this never happened, and we were subjected to the 2005 remake that easily deposits itself near the bottom of the early 2000s remake craze in terms of quality. The Fog gets unfairly forgotten in Carpenter's impressive catalog, and is often seen as almost too much of a slow burn. But honestly, there's very little fat to trim, and all of the elements work wonderfully in unison. While it wasn't one of his most well-known scores compared to Halloween or Escape from New York, it complements the visuals masterfully, as a chilling piano chord that repeats at different speeds during the different scenes, and goes full-on ambient noise when it needs to. It tells you something is out there in the fog, and that you don't want anything to do with it. The ghost zombies inside the fog even carry with them their own oppressive tune that keeps the energy exactly where it needs to be, while building a tension that is almost subliminal to the viewer while it's happening. It's honestly one of his more remarkable and unsettling scores. And that's saying something. Dean Cundey shot the movie so well with the music, and actually modeled the look of the film after Val Lewton's 1940s atmospheric horrors I Walked with a Zombie and Isle of the Dead. He described Lewton's movies as very shadowy, all suggestion, and he has all sorts of melodrama going on. I was a real fan of that sort of thing. Probably the best decision was to have Cundey shoot the movie in anamorphic widescreen. It adds to the moodiness and gives it the look of a much higher budgeted film. Speaking of which, while the movie says it was a $1 million budget, Evco Embassy spent more than 3 times that amount with the advertisements in print, radio, and TV. In addition to the traditional ways that movies were advertised, they even put fog machines in select theaters where the movie was being shown. Can you imagine seeing The Fog with some real fog? The only thing missing would be to have someone knock slowly and methodically on the theater doors during the showing. Speaking of which, the movie follows a less is more strategy in terms of its pacing. While Cundey shot the movie in that gorgeous aspect ratio, The movie doesn't fill up the screen with gore or even the revenge seekers housed in the cover of Fog. There are tons of jump scares thrown in this movie, and I'm talking the classics. These are cat jump levels of cheese. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the best moments from the movie happen in a more subtle way. The downed shipmates show up in a thick fog and knock on the door in a slow, methodical way. When you open the door, there isn't anything to see, but the second your guard goes down, they make their move.
It's such a marker for the end of the 70s, that film. It's like a goodbye to that sort of mindset.
One of the best examples of this happens early on when three men are out to sea the night before the real action begins. The fog approaches their vessel, and they are approached by a ship within said fog. It docks near them, and before the two men on the deck can react, they are surrounded and killed by the former lepers. The last man standing inside the ship is snuck up on as the glow from the lights within the fog shows the assailant getting closer and closer. It's great stuff that they don't do as much of anymore in modern horror. The rest of the kills are somehow brutal yet bloodless. Charles Cypher's weatherman and love interest to Barbeau's DJ gets killed while we watch, and Stevie listens on in horror. You see some of the weapons, but don't really get a clear look until the end of the movie, with a final jump scare that happens to be the film's best one yet. That knocking, by the way, is something that my brothers and I would do to each other at night, and is going to be a staple after I show my kids what waits in the fog. The movie was shot in April and May of 1979 for around 30 days, mostly at Raleigh Studios in Hollywood, California. They did choose a few on-location shoots to really push the coastal town vibe, with scenes filmed in Point Reyes, Bolinas, Inverness, and some of the church shots being filmed at the Episcopal Church of the Ascension in Sierra Madre. All these locations look amazing, and had fog as a regular occurrence, which is why the characters aren't worried about it at all in the beginning of the film. While everyone remembers Blake and his ghosts within the fog, a lot of the cooler scares get lost in the shuffle. DJ Stevie's son finds a gold coin that morphs into a broken plank of wood after the waves crash over it. When she takes it with her to work, it begins to leak seawater all over some equipment, and starts a speech from Blake that is probably the most eerie scene in the film. The voice is distorted, yet still pained and angry. While this is the only time you can hear his voice, a wise decision in retrospect, it stays with you the rest of the movie. The ending is great without being sequel bait too. Blake came to get his gold and take his revenge, so why would he think that the cross would take care of everything? Father Malone finds out the hard way that Blake was a man of his word. There isn't a lot of mystery behind the fog. It's just damn good movie making. Scream Factory thought enough of it, and damn near every other Carpenter classic, to give it one of their outstanding transfers, loaded with all the special features that fans love to dig into. While he tried to go back a few times to explore the idea of ghosts, most prominently in Ghosts of Mars and his final feature to date, The Ward, neither of those came close to firing on all cylinders, like his 80s opening masterpiece. While the rest of his 80s output rightfully deserves the love it gets, The Fog is certainly no slouch. Let us know in the comments what you think of this under-discussed classic. After you get through Halloween and The Thing, make sure you watch the clock. If it's 5 minutes until midnight, pop in The Fog. You have time enough for one more story, just one more to keep you warm.